Здравствуйте, and welcome to episode 25 and the last of my Soviet Union vlog. And this time we're thinking about how the rising tide of nationalism in the Soviet Union led to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Remember that in this topic that we're talking about, what we're looking at are competing explanations for why the Soviet Union fell apart. And that is to kind of weigh up different elements of the story that do overlap and fit together, but to explain why some historians put emphasis on a certain part and other historians put an emphasis on a different part. Helpful in this regard, I think, is to think about why did the Soviet Union fall apart in December 1991. So you might say, for instance, last time we were thinking about Gorbachev's political reforms and Yeltsin's role in the fall of the Soviet Union, you might say actually Yeltsin is key to understanding why the Soviet Union ends in December 1991 because of that deal he makes with the Ukrainian and Belarusian leaders and because of the support that he engenders for Russia leaving the Soviet Union, brings the whole kind of house of cards down on himself. But he could only do that because Gorbachev's political reforms had allowed him the platform and the opportunity to make his case and to bring the people with him. So therefore, Gorbachev kind of sets the atmosphere for the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's Yeltsin who actually means that it happens in 1991. So there, you're kind of splitting hairs there a little bit. Likewise, with the economy, you might say that the economy was in terminal decline. And it was obvious that at some stage the economy was going to implode in the Soviet Union. And that had been obvious for quite a while. And it was just heading down in a kind of gentle trajectory. But that maybe it wouldn't have happened in 1991. Or maybe it would have happened in the late 80s, early 90s, if Gorbachev had just kind of sat back and allowed it to keep pottering on. It might have lasted another 10 years. So the economy, therefore, is the cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but perhaps Gorbachev's tinkering and perestroika and the reforms he brought in made things implode quicker than they might have done otherwise. And that's the kind of weighing up that you're looking to do in this particular topic. Now, nationalism fits into that in a number of ways, which we'll look at in a few minutes. Let's just get started on what we mean by nationalism in the Soviet Union. And that I want to say that it does not mean that you need to know about Eastern Europe and the collapse of communism there. The Eastern European countries of Poland, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia had all had communism to a greater or lesser extent imposed on them in the late 1940s by Stalin's Soviet Union. And they had been kept communist to a greater or lesser extent ever since. Some of them with a little enthusiasm and some of them with quite a lot of opposition. In the 1980s, Gorbachev announces quite early on in his time, in the late 1980s, that he is not going to impose communism on those countries anymore. And gradually, as they realise that, and as the populations realise that, they start to resist communism, and then the communist governments there, again in various different ways, quit or are overthrown. That is not the rising tide of nationalism within the Soviet Union. That is outside the Soviet Union. However, there is no doubt that happening does inspire some of the rising nationalism and some of the opposition within the Soviet Union as people see what had happened there, understand that Gorbachev hasn't acted against them, and act themselves within the USSR. So it's worth bearing in mind. It could be mentioned, but it isn't quite what they're talking about. And be careful not to conflate the two. Sovereign states in Eastern Europe are not the same as nationalities within the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, just to be clear, was made up of a number of what are today sovereign states. Russia was by far the biggest, massive population and the dominant force within the Soviet Union. And a bit like England is the dominant force, for better or worse, within the United Kingdom, just in terms of its size and economic scale, I guess, that comes with it. And that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have proud, quite rightly, independent heritage and culture, and sometimes kind of political ideas as well, and economic ideas too. And like that, in the Soviet Union, the other kind of nations around the country resented and were discontent with the leadership that Russia had shown, not least because it wasn't really working. So the countries we're talking about here are the Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan in the Central Asian kind of area. To the east of the Black Sea, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. I think that's it. To the kind of west of the Black Sea, Ukraine and Moldova, Belarus just north of that, and then, very importantly, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And they're the most recent additions to the Soviet Union. They had been taken over by Stalin in 1939 as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact. And that's worth remembering because they have a history and heritage of independence, and they see themselves as being a little bit more in line with the other countries of Eastern Europe who are outside of the Soviet Union. So those are the territories that we're talking about. And as I said before, there's a growing discontent amongst these non-Russian nationalities for a long time. For a number of reasons. A couple of kind of easy examples of that. The Aral Sea is one that I like to use in Kazakhstan. Aral is Aral. The Aral Sea had been the world's fourth largest body of inland water. But in the 60s, when linked to Khrushchev's Virgin Lands escapade, they had diverted rivers that flowed into the Aral Sea away from the Aral Sea to try and irrigate farmland in Central Asia. And there'd been an environmental disaster. The Aral Sea, which had been great for fishing and had supported the local economy, had dried up to within a tiny fraction of what it used to be. And the people there understood and knew that this was as they saw it, the Soviet Union, the Russian-dominated Soviet Union, that was causing harm to their local nationality. Chernobyl is another great example. Chernobyl power station in Ukraine blows up in 1986, and the damage is all in Ukraine, but it's the Russian-dominated Soviet Union that is seen to have caused that. There are also tensions within the Soviet Union to a greater or less extent. They're not really the fault of Russia or the Soviet Union in particular. They're kind of there anyway. But because the Soviet Union doesn't resolve these tensions, the discontent with the centre grows more pronounced. So in 1988, the tensions in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijani nationalists spills over into conflict, and the Soviets come in and try to sort things out, but they don't really get it right. They don't satisfy anyone in the group. Probably no one could, but nevertheless, the end of that situation is that everyone feels grumpy about the Soviet Union rather than feeling happy about what they've done. Nagorno-Karabakh is spelled capital Nagorno, capital Karabakh. Likewise, in 1989, in Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia, there was Georgian nationalists were protesting against the rights of a minority group in Georgia, the Abkhazians. Soviet forces tried to restore order in the riots and ended up killing 19 Georgians. Oh, they were quite heavy-handed. It was their fault. They were to blame. They wound thousands of people. They're extremely kind of insensitive / violent in their response to this to these protests and the trouble there. Again, what happens here? Other forces could have done a better job here, but nevertheless, in responding to this trouble, what they do is fuel discontent with the Soviet regime. Likewise, again, the case of the Meskhetian Turks. These were a group of people who had been deported from their homeland in 1944 by Stalin. And actually, if you look back, loads of different national groups have been deported by Stalin in the Second World War for fear that they would help the Nazis in the Nazi invasion. And the Meskhetians had been deported from Georgia to Central Asia. In 1989, riots broke out between them, the Meskhetian Turks, and Uzbekistani locals over resources in the area where they're settled. Soviet forces come in and try to restore order, but they basically fail to do that. They don't get a compromise deal, and hundreds of Meskhetian Turks were killed or had to flee. And nearly 1,000 properties were destroyed. Thousands of Meskhetian Turks fled into exile. 70,000 went to Azerbaijan. The rest of them go to Russia. Clearly, they don't like the Soviet Union, and because twice they've been done over, but probably even the Uzbekistani locals are not particularly happy with how things had worked, and don't see the Soviet Union as being positive in this case. Meskhetian is spelled Meskk Mesk, Etian, Meskhetian, and Turks is Turk. Yes. So by far, though, the biggest centre, the best example of rising nationalism is amongst the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. As I said, they have a history of independence, and they're encouraged by the stories, in particular, they're encouraged by the stories from Eastern Europe. So they're also one of the more economically developed areas of the Soviet Union. So, whereas the Central Asian countries had kind of economically benefited from being tied to Russia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia felt like actually that they hadn't been economically developed, that they would have been fine by themselves. And indeed, sovereign countries now doing fine by themselves. Popular fronts were established in all three of those republics in 1988, calling for a protection of culture and language and then demanding independence. The 50th anniversary of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in August 1989 was used for a mass demonstration where people, literally linked arms across across the three countries in a line to demonstrate for independence and against the Soviet Union. In Supreme Soviet elections in 1990, the Popular Front won a majority of the seats for those three countries. And the Speaker of the Lithuanian Supreme Soviet, Vytautas Landsbergis, if you want it, is Lands Bergis, all one word, Landsbergis. He proclaimed Lithuanian independence in March 1990, which was illegal, but nevertheless, the other two republics followed as well. The Soviet government refused to accept this, that it allowed other countries to throw off communism in Eastern Europe, but these nationalities are republics within the Soviet Union. And so in January 1991, Red Army troops are sent into Lithuania and they try to take over the TV station there. 13 people are killed. It's quite messy, and Gorbachev ends up damaging his reputation as a moderate and as a reformer. The nationalism there is extremely important. Added to this, I'd say kind of one more thing just to link this back to the Yeltsin stuff last time. Yeltsin in Russia is surfing the other side of the nationalism. So these states tend to be wanting to break away from the Soviet Union and break away from Russia. By the same token, within Russia, Yeltsin is trying to kind of not so much sort of say, "Oh, let's get rid of all these little countries around us," but to say actually we are Russia, not the Soviet Union, and pushing on a kind of Russian nationalism button there. And of course, it's him meeting with the presidents of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, Kravchuk, and the leader of Belarus, Stanislav Shushkevich, Shushkevich. And it's them that sign what are called the Belavecha Accords. Belavecha, Belvezha Accords, which says we are going to be independent of the Soviet Union and we're going to run ourselves as Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but we'll stay kind of friends in a Commonwealth of independent states. So you could say that actually, at the end, it is nationalism that wins out in the sense of these countries, these republics within the Soviet Union voting for independence. But one last kind of but to say about this, a weakness in this argument of nationalism is that although the Baltic states have this history of nationalism, other parts of the Soviet Union don't have that. And so in Ukraine, for instance, the nationalist organization RUKH doesn't have very much support, particularly in the east part of the country, which we all know now as the Donbass. And actually, we can see that in the current conflict that's been going on between Russia and Ukraine. That actually, the eastern part is the bit where Russian troops perhaps have had more success because perhaps they've had a bit more support. It's also true to say that the Soviet Union had allowed some autonomy for these regions, these republics within the Soviet Union. And a lot of republics, as I said earlier on, were net economic gainers from the Union. So if you had an eye on the economy, then a lot of those places were thinking, maybe we don't want to break away too quickly. And 60 million Russians lived within the Soviet Union, but outside of Russia. So in Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So there's a lot of a substantial minority of those populations in those republics do want to stay part of the Soviet Union because they feel That is their homeland because it's part of Russia. And finally, in March 1991, there was a referendum. The referendum said, do you consider necessary the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, i.e., the Soviet Union, as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedom of an individual of any ethnicity will be fully guaranteed? So this is asking people to vote whether they think that the Soviet Union should stay and should act as a guarantor of the rights of everybody. 78% of people who voted in that referendum across the Soviet Union said yes. And Gorbachev uses this to attack Yeltsin, to say, yeah, actually, you, Yeltsin, are acting against the will of the people. And he is. But it should be said, the Baltic states, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova boycott the vote. So in those places, the will of the people hadn't been expressed, and there's no doubt that in the Baltic states, that people would have voted no. Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, maybe it might have been closer. However, across the rest of the Soviet Union, turnout was apparently 80%. So in those places, including Ukraine and Belarus, all the stands in Central Asia, 78% of the people that voted said that they wanted the Soviet Union to stay. And so nationalism could be seen as bringing down the Soviet Union, but that's not to say that every nationality equally wanted to bring it down. I would say if you're going to argue that nationalism bring down the Soviet Union, then you probably need to focus your argument in a little bit upon the activities of the Baltic states and the activities of those leaders, Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and the Belarusian guy whose name I forget, because they are the ones kind of engineering, exploiting really the nationalist tension to bring about the ending of the Soviet Union. If you were to push me into saying which I think is the reason, I would probably go for Gorbachev as being the key reason for the fall of the Soviet Union. And I would you can go for any of them and you can make a really good argument. But what I would say is maybe the easier argument to make in a lot of these cases is that without Gorbachev acting as he did, then people like Yeltsin and places like the Baltic states wouldn't have had the opportunity to exploit, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So why did it fall? Gorbachev. Why did it fall in 1991? Well, I think that's more open to question. I think that you could maybe argue that the nationalities and Yeltsin play a big role there. I hope that's helpful. And we've got to the end of our Soviet Union journey. So thanks for watching. And I'll see you again maybe in a different series. Bye.